presentation, we're going to focus on the metrics that are used for reporting antibiotic sales and use, and also how the data can be reported. So when you're monitoring antibiotic sales and use data, there are lots of different methods, but there are three essential components to most indicators. The first component is you need to have some way of measuring antibiotic use. So this is often called a numerator, and we'll talk about that in the next few slides. You definitely need to have a time scale. So often most metrics that you see are calendar year based, and that's because we know that some farming systems can be seasonal, so you can have higher antibiotic use at some times of year than at other times of year, and often having a kind of whole calendar year helps even that out. It doesn't have to be calendar year. I mean, some people collect antibiotic use at a batch level, so you're actually looking at each batch of animals to look at the antibiotic use within that batch. But for national reporting, most commonly it's calendar year that's used. The number two is the denominator, and that's a measure of the animal population at risk. And I mean, you don't actually need a denominator as such. I mean, you could just report, if you don't have the animal number data, you could just report tons of antibiotic, for example, as an example of a numerator, tons of antibiotic that's used. And this could be fine. You could use that every year and monitor it every year. But the problem with that is that the animal population could change from year to year, and we find in the UK that for example, a pig population may go up one year if it's if they're making more money from pigs that particular year, and similarly it can go up and down. So we find that the populations do fluctuate, and so what we're generally interested in is antibiotic use relative to the population, because that's what we can use for monitoring trends. Because you could have an increase in antibiotic use, but if that could just be related to the population going up rather than actually the practices getting worse or disease challenges. So I think it's important ideally to have a denominator, and certainly if you're going to be using any metrics to compare sectors or to compare countries or to compare farms, you do need a denominator, because some farms will be bigger than others. So what we're interested in is relative use of antibiotics relative to the size of the farm, or the number of animals in the farm, or the number of animals in the country. The first weight-based metric that I'm going to talk about is milligrams per kilogram. So in this case, and this is one that you would have heard of, or probably heard of, as one of the most common metrics that we see. And in this case, the milligrams refers to the total weight of the antibiotic active substance. And the way we calculate that is, this came up in the previous discussions as to what level of detail you do need. I mean, in order to calculate milligrams of active, then all you really need is the products, a list of the products that are the antibiotics that are being sold or used, and you need to know either how many packs of those products that have been sold and the pack size. So if you know the number of if you know the product comes in a one kilogram pack size, and that there are 100 packs sold, then you know that 100 kilograms have been sold. So that's usually all the core information, is how many packs of a particular antibiotic have been sold, and then you multiply that by the size of those packs to give you the total volume of antibiotics sold. So that's the core bit of information that you need to collect in order to do this bit of the calculation. And then the second bit of information you need to know is the strength of the product. For example, how many milligrams of active are there per kilogram of product, or per milliliter of product, or per tube, or whatever the product is. So that's the step two, is multiplying the total volumes with the product strength. This is just a simple example from a dairy farm. So you can see that the first list is the antibiotic product, and then you collect the amount used in milliliters or boluses for the case of tablets, or kilograms. It depends on the particular product. So we collect the amount used. So that's what the farmer or the vet needs to tell us. And then as long as we know the strength of that product in milligrams of active per unit, then you just multiply one by the other, and then that will give you the total milligrams of antibiotic that's been used on that particular farm. So that's the milligram part of the calculation. The next part is the denominator, and the most common denominators is kilograms of animal, especially if you're looking at milligrams per kilogram, and that is an estimate of the kind of weight of the animals on that particular farm or in the country. It depends if you're doing a national measure or a farm level measure, but it represents the weight of animals at risk. So not the weight of animals that are treated, but the overall weight of animals within the whole population. So there are different ways of calculating this. You can either look at number of animals slaughtered, and that's often used for poultry, where you look at the number of poultry that have been slaughtered in the country, and then you multiply that by a standardized weight, which commonly represents the weight at slaughter. That's the most usual way in which this is done. So you look at the average weight. For example, for poultry, you could look at the average weight of a chicken at slaughter and multiply that by the number of chickens slaughtered, and then that will give you an estimate of the overall weight of chickens slaughtered. For other sectors, it's also important to look at the average number of living animals, which is also called an animal place. For example, in the dairy cows, it's more important to consider how many living animals there are. So if you have a farm that on average has 100 dairy cows, and that's said to be 100 animal places, or you just say on average there are 100 dairy cows on that farm, and then you could multiply that by another standardized weight, which commonly represents the average living weight. So the whether you use slaughtered animals or living animals does depend on the particular sector. I would recommend that you look at the methodology from WOA. So WOA do have a standardized milligram per kilogram methodology, which does use a combination of either slaughter animals or living animals. It includes lots of different sectors: so cattle, pigs, poultry, equine, sheep, goats, and rabbits. And it does adapt the weights according to the region. So there are standardized weights that are adapted to the region, which I think is really important. People often ask when he comes up with his methodology, we were using this weight, but actually my animals aren't this weight at slaughter. I mean, the idea of these metrics is that they are an indicator. They're not necessarily going to be absolutely perfect. And as long as you're using the same weights every year, then it works in terms of trend monitoring. So I think it doesn't matter exactly if the weights don't exactly match, but it's used as an indication. So yeah. So this was a very simple example. So in this case where I said there were 100 dairy cows or 100 animal places on that farm on average, then you could assign a standard weight, say of 595 kilograms, which is the weight that Europe now use to assign to a dairy cow. And then you multiply the number of cows with the average weight of a living dairy cow, and that gives you the total weight of cows on that farm. And then the mg per kg calculation is simply take the milligram figure and divide it by this kilogram figure to give you the amount of milligrams per kilogram that in this case that's used on that farm. So it's a pretty simple calculation. Benefits of it, as I've said, is it's quite easy to understand. It's quite easy to calculate. You can use it for sales and use data. You can easily apply it to all antibiotic products, because all antibiotic products will have an amount of active ingredient, and you could also use it to create a single figure on multi-species farms, because you can assign the weight to, you can collect the total amount of antibiotic, the total number of animals, and then you can do a milligram per kilogram on that farm, from that farm on that basis. So they're the key benefits. But there are some disadvantages of milligrams per kilogram. One disadvantage is that in terms of the AMR risk, it doesn't necessarily accurately represent the number of animals treated, because if you're treating, we're talking about the poultry example, if you're giving antibiotics to chicks, then obviously the chicks are tiny, but you could actually be giving antibiotics to a lot of chicks, but it wouldn't reflect on the milligram per kilogram, because the amount of active ingredient you're giving is so small. So that's one limitation of any kind of weight-based metric, any metric that's based on weight of antibiotic. The other thing is it doesn't account for the dose rates of different products. And what we've found, what is clear is that the dose rates of products are very different. And I've got an example here where in cattle we've got an active ingredient called streptomycin, where has a dose rate of 70 milligrams per kilogram per day. So therefore, if you were giving it to a 600 kilogram cattle, that's 42,000 milligrams. Whereas in another product, ceftiofur, has a dose rate of 1 milligram per kilogram per day. So therefore, a 600 kilogram cattle would only receive 600 milligrams of active ingredient. Now, actually, ceftiofur is a third and fourth generation cephalosporin, and it's one of the critically important antibiotics. So it should be reserved as a last resort antibiotic. But you can see that if a farm could actually reduce their milligram per kilogram by using ceftiofur rather than streptomycin, even though streptomycin is more of a first line second line antibiotic maybe, but it's not a you don't want people to be using inappropriate antibiotics just because they have a lower amount of active ingredient. So that's one downside of it. And similarly, long-acting products, they have a low active ingredient because you're giving one injection potentially, and it might be lasting several days. So therefore, you will be the mg per kg will make it look like use is low, even though a long-acting injection means that product has lasted for several days. So the exposure to the antibiotic has been underrepresented in the metric. So hopefully that makes sense. So this is the WOA metric, and I know but WOA have a milligram per kilogram metric that they use to look at antibiotic use per region and per country, and this is what's on the Animuse database, which is split by country in many cases as well. So I'll now move to a milligram per kilogram, which is a relatively simple metric, and I'll try and explain another metric which overcomes some of the limitations, not all of them, but some of the limitations of milligram per kilogram, and this is called a defined daily dose metric, but it is a little bit more complicated. So, but the idea of this daily dose metric is to take into account the fact that products have different dose rates. So effectively, what they want to do is treat every antibiotic the same. So you're not products with high dose rates aren't being overrepresentative, and products with low dose rates being underrepresented. So what you do is you have to know the dose rate. So you take the dose rate for every active ingredient and every route of administration. You have to know what is the standard dose rate for that particular species or sector. So the dose rates will differ for different species. So you have to do this at a species level, and it can only be used for usage data that is split by species. So what you do is you find the dose rate for that species for the most common indication. If it's a long-acting product, you actually have to divide, sorry, this is the daily dose. This is the amount that you give for one day. So if it's twice a day, if a product's given twice a day, you'd have to multiply that by 2. And if it's a long-acting product, you actually also need to divide by the length of activity, because what you're interested in is the number of days that these animals are exposed to an antibiotic. So that's step one, is what is the dose rate for that particular product. The second stage is we've already collected the denominator, which is the total kilograms of animal at risk that I talked about before. So what you do is you multiply that standard dose rate with the weight of animals at risk. And what this actually does, it takes a bit of thinking about, but it does give you the total milligrams of active ingredient that you would expect if every animal received 1 day of an antibiotic. So that's what, but take the standard daily dose rate with the weight of the animals, and that's what that gives you. And then the final step, which is to get you the overall figure, is you take the total amount of milligrams that you for each product, or which we've talked about how you calculate that before, and then you divide that by the calculation in step 2. And what you end up with is the average number of days that each animal received an antibiotic. So I've mentioned that the bottom calculation gives you the number of milligrams if they'd received 1 day. And so if you end up with a daily dose figure of 1, then that means exactly that. It means that on average, each animal has received 1 day of antibiotic. If you get a figure of 2, then it means that each animal on average has received 2 days of antibiotics. In reality, not every animal will have received an antibiotic, but the idea is that this is just an indication of how many days the animals have received an antibiotic, rather than the amount of active ingredient. So you need to carry out this calculation for every active ingredient, every route of administration, and then you add that together. and you end up with a figure that represents the average number of days that each animal has received an antibiotic. So this is just an example of the calculation of that farm that I talked about before, where we have the list of the products. We have the daily dose rate, which is the amount of active ingredient that you give for one single day for the most common indication for that product. And you can see it differs for the different products. We have the milligrams of antibiotics used, which we've explained previously. We have the denominator, which I've already talked about, which is the number of dairy cows multiplied by the average weight of a dairy cow. And then you just do the calculation, which is milligrams divided by the dose rate multiplied by the kilograms, which is the denominator. And you do that for each product, and then you add them all together. And I mean, it looks a bit complicated, but it's actually a relatively simple calculation. And it does use the same information that you collect for mg per kg. And then you end up, in this case, you ended up with a figure of 0.4, which meant that on average, each of those dairy cows received 0.43 days of antibiotics. Main benefit is that you actually treat each antibiotic the same. You normalize based on the dose rate and the length of activity. And also, although the whole term defined daily dose it sounds quite complicated, if we explain to the farmers that this just represents the number of days that each animal on average receives an antibiotic, that's actually a relatively easy concept to understand. But the limitations is, as I've shown, it takes more explaining than milligram per kilogram. The standard dose rates may not actually represent the dose rates that are used in practice, although I think it doesn't matter too much as long as you do the same thing each time. There are actually some products where it's quite difficult to determine. You may not know what the average dose rate is, and it's sometimes quite difficult to calculate the average dose rate. So that's one potential limitation. And also it has to be usage data because the dose rates will differ quite a lot by species, so you can't really use it for analyzing sales data. These are our weight-based metrics. I've just got a very, very short slide about count-based metrics, which are a slightly different way of doing things. So the weight-based metrics are all based on the weight of active ingredient, but there are some metrics that are actually where you actually collect detailed data. So this could be, you might have data on the number of animals on the farm that have received an antibiotic. And so if you know the number of animals that have received an antibiotic and you know the average number of animals on that farm, then you could easily create a percentage where you could say this percentage of animals have been treated with antibiotics. And that's something that the farmer can find very easy to understand. And the point prevalence survey, and that could be something you could do there. If you go onto a farm one day, how many animals are on antibiotics, how many animals are not on antibiotics, and then you create a percentage. It's something that can be done very easily. And similarly, this is something that our laying hen sector does, is they collect the data on the number of days that an animal's received an antibiotic, and then they compare that with the number of days that overall animals are on a farm during that particular period. And again, they can present that as a percentage, which is quite easy to understand. So the advantage is that they do represent the number of animals receiving an antibiotic better than weight-based metrics. So chicks are treated the same as adult poultry, for example, if you're just looking at number of animals, which I think is a good thing. It does take into account dose rate differences because you're looking at number of animals treated, number of days treated. The dose rate doesn't matter. So every antibiotic will be treated the same. It will use actual data, so you're not relying on assumptions on weight or assumptions on dose. And it's pretty easy to calculate and understand on the farm, but the main limitation is it does require detailed and accurate record keeping. And certainly in the UK, a lot of sectors would struggle to get that level of detail. It's quite easier to get volume data because that's something that the vets and farmers have to record. And sometimes actually getting data on number of days treated or a number of animals treated is not as easy. So, yeah. This is a summary that there are broadly two types of metrics that I talked about in this presentation. So the weight-based metrics, which could include total tons, where you have no denominator at all. If you can't get a denominator, then that's better than doing nothing. But then you've also got the milligram per kilogram, which is the most commonly used metric. But I think there is value in considering for usage data in particular, considering a daily dose metric, which takes into account the different dose rates and treats each antibiotic the same. And then we also have the count-based metrics, which I think can be very useful, particularly at a farm level, where you're looking at the percentage of animals treated or percentage of days treated.